Thanks a lot. Good afternoon. Very nice to meet you all. My name is Alexander Kmentt. I'm working in the Austrian Foreign Ministry with a specialization now for 25 years on disarmament issues, specifically humanitarian disarmament, the nexus between disarmament and international humanitarian law. And so I've been involved very closely in the work on landmines, cluster munitions, arms trade treaties, small arms, light weapons, then specifically the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and as of late also very much on the so far futile attempts to regulate autonomous weapon systems. And the seeming transition into my tone is talking about humanitarian disarmament in the age of growing geopolitical competition and tension, which I think is very much in all of our minds. So thank you very much for the opportunity to get out of Vienna and to be here and talk to you and have the chance to meet you and discuss these issues, which are very close to my heart. The discussion, the conference, of course, takes place at a time when many of the principles and norms that have been established over decades through painstaking processes of negotiations and cooperation to prevent, reduce, and mitigate the human dimension or the human cost of warfare are severely challenged and are undermined and are in danger of becoming collateral damage to the worsening geopolitical tensions. So we are, of course, also very much at the moment under the impression of the US election and wondering what the impact will be of a second Trump presidency on multilateralism, on international law and international security. And we don't know, other than it will be probably a profound impact. The most important, most dramatic development in the field of international security arguably is Russia's aggression against Ukraine. But the negative trends and challenges to international humanitarian law and more broadly to the entire multilateral and international law-based system, they have been going on for longer. So we talk very much now about Russia and Ukraine, but actually the challenges have been going on for longer. So one of the key gains of the past 30 years in international law, and that are today at stake, is progress achieved in what is called humanitarian disarmament. And these gains are particularly challenged by today's armed conflicts and by the loss of trust, of increasing arms race dynamics, and mindsets of preparing for military confrontations and multiple geopolitical hotspots. So I will speak about humanitarian disarmament, about what this concept even is, what has been achieved, and how its accomplishments are increasingly challenged today. I will also look later at the concrete case of autonomous weapon systems as a case in point. And this is one of the key new issues on the international, or relatively new issues on the international agenda that really should be addressed urgently through a humanitarian disarmament lens and one or more legally binding instruments, but where such efforts are until today thwarted by geopolitics. And of course, I'm coming to these topics from a practitioner's rather than an academic perspective. And my remarks will also be made in my personal capacity. So first of all, what is humanitarian disarmament? I don't think an accepted definition exists, but I think this description is quite accurate, that humanitarian disarmament seeks to prevent and remediate arms-inflicted human suffering and environmental harm through the establishment and implementation of norms. So this approach to disarmament is people-centered in substance and in process. Also, humanitarian disarmament is guided by a bottom-up and a rights-based approach, which emphasizes the rights of conflict and displacement-affected communities to safety and security. Humanitarian disarmament also juxtaposes the military utility of weapons and weapon systems, such as, for example, anti-personnel landmines and cluster munitions, with the humanitarian effects, short-term and long-term, and these weapons have on civilians and on affected communities. So it is an effects-based versus a military utility approach. The focus is in part the discriminate or inhumane nature of certain weapons, and other weapons are problematic due to the manner of their use, their trade and proliferation, or their lingering effects. And of course, the conceptual basis of this approach is human security. So it's the security of people rather than the security of states, and on increasing the protection of civilians by reducing the humanitarian and environmental impacts of weapons. So humanitarian disarmament focuses on people and on their security and on the prevention and remediation of humanitarian harm. Disarmament refers to a broad range of issues and actions, from destroying weapons to prohibiting their use, their production, their development, etc., to clearing up weapons such as unexploded ordnance, to activities related to the rights of victims, such as victim assistance, victim care, rehabilitation, socioeconomic inclusion, and their rights. Disarmament is thus here used as a means to address, in the sense of prevention and remediation, urgent humanitarian and human security problems and challenges caused by weapons. And this is different from the more traditional disarmament and arms control approaches, which refer more to the codification of reductions or eliminations of weapon systems that major military powers have concluded of either not requiring anymore, or where limitation serves their security and stability interests. However, humanitarian disarmament has also come to represent other aspects, namely a different approach to disarmament diplomacy itself. It means a more democratic approach that gives voice to states and communities that are often disenfranchised in multilateral affairs, which are dominated, of course, by the interest of the so-called major players. This is demonstrated by the manner in which the humanitarian disarmament treaties were negotiated, which was either through ad hoc process or through the UN General Assembly, and these processes, by their nature, challenged the absolute control of multilateral disarmament frameworks by the powerful states, in particular the P5, for example, by rejection the obligation of consensus in the negotiations. Because such an obligation often leads to a veto mindset or to a lowest common denominator approach, and which has come to dominate the traditional disarmament process. Whereas the possibility of voting actually leads to an incentive of working towards a consensus. So the priority in humanitarian disarmament is given to the solution of humanitarian challenges, meaning that outcomes that only represent a lowest common denominator approach are not the solution that is sought. The objective is to establish higher level norms that would actually address the humanitarian challenge at hand. For example, an absolute prohibition of anti-personnel mines to prevent the future use and future humanitarian harm. So the strength of the humanitarian disarmament norm is thus given precedent to universal membership of the norm. Humanitarian disarmament processes are also characterized by a much more inclusive multi-stakeholder involvement. They are more open to academia, to NGOs, to experts and affected communities, who often work together as partners to achieve a more ambitious outcome. So humanitarian disarmament represents a more internationalist, common and collective security approach that is based on shared rights and norms and a human security vision. It therefore also represents a globalist or common security perspective that is partly a counter-model to the prevailing narrower national security perspectives of states. Moreover, humanitarian disarmament gives due importance to the nexus between security and development, namely the socio-economic impact of the use of weapons and of the arms trade, the use of resources for armaments as against for socio-economic purposes. So my second point is, what have been the successes of humanitarian disarmament, of this approach, and what are the limitations? I would say the main success in many ways is to have actually developed the concept of humanitarian disarmament in the first place, to have established it in the international discourse on weapons issues as an integral part of disarmament diplomacy, albeit a very contested one. Is this always done against very significant resistance? And it is, of course, an ongoing process. A very different perspective about security, about disarmament diplomacy, and so on in the international community are present at the same time and are competing with each other. The key successes that are usually referred to have created legally binding instruments that contain strong prohibition norms on specific weapons categories, and these are primarily the Mine Ban Treaty in 1997, the Convention on Cluster Munitions in 2009, and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in 2017. It's significant to have achieved these three treaties on weapons categories, where multilateral work on these issues have been going on for a very long time. Well, however, progress was elusive and impossible due to the resistance of some or more of the major military powers. These three treaties were thus achieved despite and against the objections of some of those states that usually control multilateral processes. They were achieved through a combination of public diplomacy and effective multi-stakeholder cooperation. And the international campaign to ban landmines and the international campaign for the abolition of nuclear weapons received the Nobel Peace Prizes in 1997 and 2017, respectively, for their work to achieve these treaties. However, the humanitarian disarmament approach has also influenced other significant treaties and instruments, such as the Programme of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons in 2001, the Arms Trade Treaty in 2013, as well as the recent political declaration on the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, which was adopted in 2017. And you can see it also impacting on the current multilateral discussions on autonomous weapon systems, which I will address a bit later. So the humanitarian disarmament was relatively easy to make in the case of landmines and cluster munitions. While there may be a compelling military utility of employing such a weapon at a certain moment in the conflict, this pales in light of the long-lasting humanitarian and socio-economic impact for affected communities long after the conflict has ended. If, for example, a child is maimed by a landmine 20 or 30 years after the mine was laid, the military utility argument becomes very hard to justify. The same goes when cluster munitions with failure rates of up to 50% or more remain in the ground as dangerous explosive remnants of war and kill or maim civilians long after the conflict. So the clear-cut prohibition treaties on anti-personnel landmines and cluster munitions are the most significant successes of humanitarian disarmament. Both treaties, but especially the Mine Ban Treaty, saw a large uptake by affected states to destroy their stockpiles, to clear mined areas, and to assist victims of these weapons. They also led to a significant change of state practice, even among states that did not join these treaties, through the legal and political stigmatization of these weapons. So these conventions have made a real difference on the ground. Nevertheless, the norms against mines and cluster munitions are all still very contested, of course, and are challenged by conflicts such as in Syria, in Yemen, and now by the war in Ukraine. The case of Ukraine is particularly challenging, with massive and indiscriminate use of mines and cluster munitions by Russia in disregard of humanitarian norms and international humanitarian law, but also alleged use of these weapons by Ukraine in its self-defense. The recent delivery of cluster munitions to Ukraine by the US was, for example, widely reported and criticized. The case of Ukraine is particularly challenging. Sorry, I've already got it. Ukraine is a state party of the Mine Ban Treaty, but it's not the state party of the Convention on Cluster Munitions. And Ukraine, being a state party of the Mine Ban Treaty, raises, of course, very difficult legal and ethical issues, given that Ukraine's case for legitimate self-defense is so obvious. There are some voices in Ukraine that appear to think about leaving the Mine Ban Convention. However, while there must, of course, be understanding for the predicament of Ukraine on this issue, I believe that this is, in reality, it provides a very strong case for humanitarian disarmament and the prohibition of use of these indiscriminate weapons. Because the socioeconomic and humanitarian cost of these weapons will regrettably be immense and long-lasting, and be made worse if Ukraine would resort to widespread use of these indiscriminate weapons as well. So do military reasons and possible advantages at the moment justify the long-term impacts? There's of course no easy answer for any of this, but past experiences with landmines use in conflicts have shown very comprehensively that the long-term effects far outweigh the military advantages of a certain moment. Another interesting case is Lithuania, which has recently taken the decision to withdraw from the Convention on Cluster Munitions. The main argument was needing to demonstrate absolute readiness to defend itself against Russia if needed. The argument was thus a deterrence point, and Lithuania underscored its continued commitment to international humanitarian law and the goals of the Convention. So no one can deny that the threat perception in Lithuania because of Russia's actions is justified. Its military obviously thinks that cluster munitions would be a weapon that would indicate the defense readiness that they think is needed, and that would be an effective weapon in defending against a possible Russian aggression. So Lithuania is hence signaling preparedness of potentially contaminating significant portions of its territory with unexploded ordnance, with potential severe and long-term humanitarian consequences to its own population. However, also here, past cluster munitions use in conflicts have shown a massive humanitarian legacy. So there's very clear evidence that the military utility at a certain moment does not outweigh these long-lasting humanitarian consequences. In the case of Lithuania, there's also a more broad political element to consider, because this was the first withdrawal from a humanitarian disarmament treaty, and it was done from a Western state and EU member state. So what does this mean, and what does this signal? I think it risks signaling that the respect for international law and norms that the West, and specifically the EU, seeks to promote and says is part of its DNA, that this is contingent. If EU member states walk away from international law and international treaty, we signal this contingency to the rest of the world. So what does it mean for respect for international law in other parts of the world, on international humanitarian law or human rights law, for example? International law cannot be contingent. In the fight for the global narrative of democracies versus autocracies or dictatorships, of right versus might, this is absolutely crucial. I worry that it sends a very negative signal of A, Western double standards, and B, of playing into the hands of actors that violate international humanitarian law, such as President Putin. If the West or the EU itself starts taking apart international law, we do a favor to actors like Putin. One key aspect that we can hold against such actors is our own insistence on multilateralism and international law. So this case demonstrates the challenges, but I think also the importance of defending high international legal standards, even at times of geopolitical difficulties, and even when one is faced with actors who do not show the same or any commitment to international law. So I want to look briefly at the nuclear weapons issue. With nuclear weapons, making the humanitarian disarmament case for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is at the same time easier, and it's very obvious, as well as more challenging. Because on the one hand, the humanitarian consequences and human security dimension of any nuclear weapon use is, of course, absolutely clear. They were also the focus of several international conferences on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, including two organized by the Austrian Foreign Ministry in 2014 and 2022. These conferences presented a significant body of research that the consequences and risks of nuclear weapons are more severe and more complex than previously assumed. And this The conferences and the body of evidence were the precursor of the Treaty on the Prohibition through the Humanitarian Pledge, which was presented by Austria in 2014 and which was supported by 130 states. All the research that I have seen leads to the clear conclusion that the broad range of humanitarian and environmental consequences of nuclear weapons use would be far more severe and widespread, likely global, than previously understood, and the same goes for the risks associated with nuclear weapons and the practice of nuclear deterrence that are also significantly graver and more complex. The humanitarian disarmament case with nuclear weapons is therefore obvious and cogent. The focus with nuclear weapons thus can never be remediation, it must be prevention. So on the other hand, while the actual military utility of nuclear weapons is very much in question, their political and strategic value is considered very high by those states that have these weapons or rely on security assurances by nuclear armed states. As a result, the nuclear weapons discourse is probably one of the most contested spaces in international relations, and this is also very visible in the TPNW. So it was a significant success that the TPNW was achieved against very forceful opposition by the nuclear armed states, which continues to this day. They still apply pressure on states not to join the treaty. Nevertheless, 94 have so far signed and 73 have ratified, and membership continues to grow slowly but surely. The TPNW and the humanitarian focus had also have significant impact on the nuclear debate. The treaty and its underlying rationale of new scientific evidence on the consequences and risks of nuclear weapons challenges the nuclear status quo. It challenges the legality and the legitimacy of a security approach that is based on nuclear deterrence and the persistent threat of global mass destruction. It also raises very profound issues related to international justice and also intergenerational justice. So the core argument of the TPNW is thus that nuclear deterrence, as practiced by a limited number of states, comes with extreme high risks and at the expense of the security of all other states, whose populations could end up as collateral damage in much more severe ways than previously understood. So the notion that nuclear weapons are essential for the security of some states must therefore be considered as questionable from a factual and ethical standpoint, and is of high relevance not only for states that have these weapons, but for all humanity. The humanitarian disarmament approach to nuclear weapons makes the case for a paradigm shift on nuclear weapons. It has high legal, political, and discursive importance at the time when we see many states refocusing on nuclear weapons and on nuclear deterrence, and where the nuclear taboo looks increasingly fragile and nuclear proliferation pressures are getting bigger. In fact, the TPNW, I think, is today the only international development that tries to make the case against higher reliance on nuclear weapons and the return to multiple nuclear arms race dynamics. A few more words about the limits and challenges of humanitarian disarmament. The broadening of the understanding of security as human security did get traction from 1990s onwards, which of course seems like a completely different time. It is, of course, but it also seems like that. The logic that a strong norm over universality will create normative pressure and will change behavior and state practice over time had some important successes, as I mentioned. But it certainly does not have an overarching success. It's, for example, difficult to reach and impact the security policy discourse in big military powers. Moreover, there's more debate on these issues in democratic states, but little impact in autocratic ones, which are under less scrutiny from public discourse. Today, this approach is increasingly challenged as we see more attraction into military and state-centered or nationalist understandings of security as a function of increasing geopolitical tension. This is coupled with an overall loss of trust in multilateral and international law-based approaches. Moreover, IHL and the protection of civilians in armed conflict appears to be challenged widely. The humanitarian principle and IHL considerations are in retreat against the logic driven by military security perspectives and geopolitics. The Russian aggression against Ukraine has had significant impact on some states that were more open to humanitarian disarmament, for example in Europe, and Lithuania's withdrawal that I mentioned is one example. The conflicts in Syria, in Yemen, and Sudan have shown extremely high numbers of civilian casualties and a dramatic lack of respect for IHL and the protection of civilians. The conflict in Gaza, with its high number of civilian casualties in densely populated urban environment, is another example of how humanitarian and IHL principles are challenged in today's conflict situations. Some actors openly disregard humanitarian norms. In others, especially also in democracies, the weighing of humanitarian and IHL principles against military considerations appears to be shifting as well. All this takes place against a deteriorating geopolitical backdrop and a crisis of democratic systems versus autocratic systems that challenge the universal value of some of the key legal concepts of the past decades, such as IHL and human rights law. We can only speculate what the impact of the US presidential election will be, but judging from the first Trump administration, I think we will see an approach significantly less focused on multilateral cooperation in IHL. And this could create further challenges for countries trying to promote human security and humanitarian disarmament approaches, for example, in Europe. We may see further heightening of geopolitical tensions with Russia, with China, and in the South China Sea, with the DPRK, but also in the Middle East, of course, and including multiple and complex arms race dynamics that further reduce the space for humanitarian disarmament. This progressively deteriorating geopolitical environment takes place at the same time as we see major technological developments that have significant bearing on the military domain and thus also on IHL. The key developments in this field are in the field of cyber, of hypersonic technologies, of quantum technologies, and of course artificial intelligence. We refer to them as new and disruptive technologies. In my view, the most dramatic development, which has most bearing on my topic today, is the increasing integration of autonomy, artificial intelligence, into weapon systems, what is called autonomous weapon systems, or vulgo killer robots. And I want to talk briefly towards the end of my talk about the state of efforts to regulate autonomous weapon systems. So what are those systems? Again, we don't have a clear definition, but generally it's weapon systems which, once activated, select targets and apply force without further human intervention. And they raise, of course, concerns from a legal, from an ethical, and security perspective. Fundamental challenges relate to the nature of human control over such weapons, to accountability, and the overall compatibility of such weapon systems with international law, specifically international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Processing people as data through algorithms and subsequently choosing them as targets in conflicts raises fundamental ethical concerns regarding the dignity of the person and moral demands from the principles of humanity and the requirements of public conscience. As with any data set, there is a risk of bias. Removing human judgment, human empathy, and human accountability from life and death decisions risks making wars even more and truly inhumane. Autonomous weapon systems also present global risks to peace and security, including risks of proliferation to non-state armed groups. Autonomous weapon systems that promise the advantage of speed may not allow for meaningful human control and risk destabilizing international security. A dangerous autonomy arms race looms. The risks concern all states and all parts of society and have disproportionate effects on those more vulnerable. So given the extreme speed with which the AI revolution unfolds, autonomous weapons are no longer an issue for the future. Autonomy in weapons is increasingly used in conflicts today. They are used increasingly in Ukraine, and AI-based targeting systems are said to be used by Israel in Gaza. Autonomous weapon systems will soon and fundamentally change the nature of wars, and militaries all over the world are looking at them, and so do, of course, non-state actors. The challenges and risks of autonomous weapons thus concern all states and all parts of society. So UN Secretary General Guterres and ICRC President Spoljaric-Egger have recently jointly called on world leaders to launch negotiations of a legally binding instrument to set clear prohibitions and restrictions on autonomous weapon systems and to conclude such negotiations by 2026. They also stated, and I quote, "We must act now to preserve human control over the use of force. Human control must be retained in life and death decisions. The autonomous targeting of humans by machines is a moral line that we must not cross. Machines with the power and discretion to take lives without human involvement should be prohibited by international law." End of quote. So we cannot prevent the development of autonomous weapon systems. This ship has sailed, but we can and must work on rules to contain their most significant risks. One cannot overstate the urgency. The mismatch between the speed and resources that drive the development of these weapons and the lackluster international efforts to regulate them is absolutely striking. On top of this, again, geopolitical tensions and mistrust risk pushing us into a vicious circle, hampering global discussions while fueling an AI arms race. Am I still okay for time?
I think Ido is keeping track of time.
Yeah? Okay, I have a few more minutes. I don't want to. So for 10 years, a group of governmental experts has been discussing these issues in the context of the Certain Conventional Weapons Convention in Geneva. This is, of course, an IHL treaty, and the focus of discussion is on IHL, such as how such weapons could be used in accordance with IHL. And obviously, machines that take decisions, in inverted commas, on the basis of algorithms and situational machine learning raise very serious challenges on issues such as distinction and proportionality, among others. The discussions in this group have been useful and have helped increase the understanding of participating states of the challenges that need to be addressed. An understanding has emerged, but no consensus yet, but it is growing, that the way to go would be a so-called two-tier approach of prohibiting certain autonomous weapon systems, especially those that could not be used in compliance with international humanitarian law, and to regulate other autonomous weapons in a way that a certain meaningful human control or human in the loop in decision-making is retained. So autonomous weapons are thus a real case in point for a humanitarian disarmament approach. Prevention of humanitarian harm through the prohibition of weapons that may pose extreme risks through prohibitions and regulations. However, this is where geopolitics comes in. Trust has broken down among states. Key states expect their competitors to cheat, to do the worst. And while everybody agrees in principle that we need to do something, we cannot seem to move forward in the group of governmental experts. We cannot make the switch from a discussion mandate that is fairly broad and been going on for years to initiating actual negotiations for a legally binding instrument, even though we in reality know what we would have to do. So Russia has been playing a particularly obstructionist role. Whenever it comes to making meaningful recommendations to move from discussions forward, they are blocked, but there are other states that are hiding behind this. It seems to be politically acceptable for some states to be able to say that they are engaged in serious discussions to develop rules, while at the same time they can blame Russia or other countries when we can't move forward. And of course, at the same time, everybody's building these things. So given the absolute urgency of this issue, this is, in my view, a dereliction of duties. The window for taking some preventative action is almost closed. And for this reason, and to broaden the debate about beyond the group of governmental experts and to generate momentum for regulation, Austria pushed to introduce this issue also into the UN General Assembly, which of course is a more inclusive and representative body. And so in 2022, we first initiated a joint statement on this issue, which was supported by 70 states. And in 2023, we introduced the first ever resolution in the General Assembly on this issue, which was supported by over 160 states. And with that, we tasked the UN Secretary General to seek the views of member states on the breadth of these issues and produce a comprehensive report. To support this process, Austria organized the biggest international conference on this issue in Vienna, and I have a few brochures here for those of you who are interested afterwards. So the Vienna conference tried to make the case that we need to look beyond international humanitarian law only, also address international human rights law, ethical aspects, as well as international security aspects. Just like to list a few of the chair's conclusions that came up in the discussions. So the rules of international humanitarian law and human rights law are addressed to people individually and collectively. Accountability is central to legal systems and cannot be transferred to machines. Effective governance is necessary to avoid an accountability gap. The informed moral engagement of human decision makers is the basis of our legal frameworks governing the use of force. It's what makes people responsible and accountable for the outcomes that occur. Systems that cannot be adequately understood or limited to a specific context cannot be subject to human control and would not be compatible with legal use and accountability. The seriousness of risks regarding autonomous weapons requires us to establish clear prohibitions and regulations to preserve the human element in the use of force. Targeting people is a most pressing ethical issue. Furthermore, autonomous weapons that would function by distinguishing certain groups of people from others would be liable to problems of bias in data sets and algorithms that they are built on. This could disproportionately affect already marginalized groups and lead to grievous errors. Increased levels of autonomy in weapon systems also raise serious challenges with regard to international peace and security, distance and dehumanization, the risks of lowering the political threshold to the use of force, as well as escalation risks, including by machine-to-machine interactions, raise further concerns. Proliferation of autonomous weapons to non-state armed groups and other violent actors may escalate security risks in armed conflicts, as well as in law enforcement. We have a responsibility to act. So this chair's summary was also put forward to the Secretary General as input for his report. He received a huge amount of input by states, the biggest ever actually, and the report was presented in July 2024. The key conclusions of this report underscoring the urgency, underscoring the need for regulation, the breadth of the issue, IHL and others, support for the group of governmental experts to fulfill its mandate, but also support for the General Assembly to remain engaged, such as by organizing informal consultations of this issue. So Austria, together with the other co-sponsors, we then produced another resolution to respond to the Secretary General's report, which was adopted just a couple of days ago, again by a strong majority of more than 160 states. However, in the run-up, it was very disappointing to see how some states reacted. First of all, Russia behaved as expected and rejected everything and voted no. But the position of most Western states was also quite antagonistic vis-à-vis the initial proposal of holding informal discussions in the framework of the General Assembly. All sorts of arguments were used to justify this opposition, but at the core of it lies the insistence that this issue can and should only be addressed in the IHL context and in this group of governmental experts, despite the fact that it's pretty clear that it will be very difficult to move forward in this forum. It shows a preference is effectively given to no regulation unless it is universal, e.g. also includes competitors such as Russia. While this may be understandable, it is short-sighted, and as I said, I think it's a dereliction of duty and actually irresponsible, in my view, because without any rules on these issues, on these weapons will be in widespread use in a very short time in all conflicts all over the world, and it will be much more difficult to set any rules retroactively. So this is a perfect example, in my view, where a humanitarian disarmament approach would be absolutely essential, probably even of existential importance, because a lot of people refer to autonomous weapons as an existential threat. But where short-termism and geopolitical mindsets of arms race dynamics trump everything. So let me close with a few concluding points. The fact that the international situation is currently very challenging does not absolve us from the political responsibility to address the challenges of autonomous weapon systems, or to continue to make the case for international humanitarian law and a humanitarian disarmament approach. This is not contingent, quite the opposite. The voices and coalitions of states and regional bodies, UN entities, international organizations, civil society, academia, as well as voices from the private sector, who continue to argue for this, are today even more important. A further slide into geopolitical tensions, multiple arms race dynamics, and the weakening of the multilateral and international law-based system cannot be in the interest of the vast majority of states. In fact, it must be in the vital interest of this majority, and indeed all humanity, to counter such trends with urgency and determination. And the humanitarian disarmament approach is a vital component of this. This is important even though we can expect the years to come to be particularly challenging. But despite these challenges, or rather because of them, it's today even more important to keep states engaged in these debates, as all states have agency and very legitimate security concerns related to these weapons. So positive change on these intractable and difficult issues can only come through a much broader and inclusive societal and international multi-stakeholder discourse. The alternative is a rather dark future that we should try our utmost to avoid. And I think I was a bit long, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alexander. We're now going to open for Q&A from the table. Just see if there are any jumpers in the beginning. Or I'll ask, yeah, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm more interested into your perspective on whether human security in the humanitarian disarmament approach excludes state security. So how these two values interoperate in this humanitarian disarmament discourse. In your opinion, of course.
I don't think, of course, human security cannot replace it, but it must complement it. I think the problem is, I think the accomplishment of the human security approach was that it started to complement and enrich the debates. It can never replace the classical security perspective, but it is really important to give much more weight also to the human security aspect. So security as a concept must be approached much more broadly than merely, in inverted commas, from a state-centered process. That would be my answer, but of course it's not a substitute. It's an important complement. Completely replacing humans is problematic in no matter what context. It raises serious issues, but of course, when it comes to the most fundamental decision about life and death, I think it's really important to bring in the ethical aspect. So it may be possible, of course, and that's an argument that is brought quite frequently from some of the tech guys, that you could foresee weapons that actually reduce collateral damage, that are more precise, that are less prone to to the type of errors that humans make. but what does it mean for the fundamental concept of accountability? And so it's a difficult question, but I would say I prefer a situation where humans remain accountable for decisions over life and death, maybe even if sometimes they go wrong. Because if we lose the human accountability aspect, I think our entire concept of law goes through the window. And unless we find a way to deal with that, I think it's really important to keep this aspect. There are, for example, one of the discussions of weapon systems that should be excluded from any future regulation are purely defensive systems, and there are, for example, anti-missile. I mean, the Iron Dome, for example. That is clearly a defensive weapon that has to work on speed and is already today working very much with autonomy. The problems of accountability there. I mean, there may be some, but they're really small because it's clearly a defensive system. So you have to differentiate between, of course, what's the objective and what's the purpose of it. But I think in general, removing the human out of these processes raises very serious issues, and nowhere more than when it comes to the decision over life and death.
Thank you for your presentation. From your experience, how would you better advise to operationalize IHL in terms of combating contamination, environmental contamination?
Better operationalize. I don't know. I think it's fair to say it's very difficult. It's of course the first aspect is to include it in the normative framework, which is something, for example, we have done as a first in the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which includes positive obligations on victim assistance and environmental remediation. That relates specifically to the contamination of past nuclear weapons tests. And we have, of course, some states parties like Kazakhstan or some of the Pacific Island states where this is still a really, really massive problem. So we are in the process of operationalizing this treaty obligation. It's really difficult. It's really difficult. So first of all, you have to have data. You have to have a needs assessment and all of that. But it starts with the normative framework, I think, and in the traditional disarmament world, these types of impact, such as victim assistance or environmental impact, have been excluded, and the humanitarian disarmament approach started to bring it in. So also mine clearance, all the practices related to humanitarian demining, they of course have an environmental aspect as well. I'm not an expert there, so it's difficult to operationalize it. But I think it really started to. It's important to include it in the normative framework as an issue that could be dealt with. How it's done in practice is challenging, and I don't really know.
Thank you. Lots of questions. I'd be intrigued to know what has driven Austria to play such a role championing humanitarian disarmament, and then perhaps a few ideas from you. It got bleaker and bleaker as you were talking, so a few ideas in terms of how to maintain the FE in the coming years.
Many aspects to answer the history of why Austria got involved. It's I've actually studied once the government programs going back to 1953, And you find references to that since right from the beginning. So there is a continuity. And Austrian politicians have played a reasonably active role. Part, I think, of the attempt to sort of give life to active neutrality policy. When the Cold War ended in the 1990s, several things happened at the same time. We, of course, it was the golden age of disarmament diplomacy with lots of breakthroughs, and of course the peace dividends seemed to be really, really big. We joined the European Union. We became a member of the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, and it became an issue where diplomatic opportunities opened themselves up. And it started off with our work on anti-personnel landmines, which is really, we were a member at the time of the Human Security Network, which doesn't exist anymore, so the whole discussion around responsibility to protect, all of these issues happened at the same time, which seemed very attractive politically for Austria to be involved. And then we happened to get involved in the work on landmines. And this is the blueprint in many ways that was followed. It's the idea of governments and civil society working together, a strong campaign based on the evidence from the ground, including bringing affected communities to negotiations, that it's not an abstract security issue, but a concrete humanitarian issue. And we were one of the few countries. It happened a little bit by coincidence. My predecessor, understanding that this is a political opportunity and getting buy-in from the political level. But that blueprint became attractive because from the end of the 1990s onwards, the golden age of disarmament started to be over and things became much more difficult. I mean, the US not ratifying the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and first the George W. Bush administration with a very skeptical approach to arms control in general. So it became very difficult. So the humanitarian disarmament approach, as I said, pushed issues irrespective of whether the P5 were on board. They pushed the humanitarian argument. It became the niche where countries that wanted to be proactive tried to find opportunities. And that then happened in the work on small arms and light weapons, on cluster munitions, the Arms Trade Treaty, and so on. And from our perspective, it culminated in the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And on nuclear weapons in particular, I can say that there is an all-party consensus in Austria. If a politician wants to absolutely be sure to end his or her career, he or she says something positive about nuclear energy or nuclear weapons. So it's absolutely clear. So there is a consensus, and every government program reaching back decades stipulates that Austria should play an active role for a world to promote a world without nuclear weapons. So the focus on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons happened in conjunction, you remember the Obama speech in 2009, the Prague speech, which sort of really reinvigorated the nuclear disarmament field, but that was extremely short-lived. And we and others, essentially stimulated by that speech, started to operationalize the discussion on humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. And that got momentum that we actually did not anticipate ourselves. And it became so as the multilateral process in the NPT and so on became more and more discredited, there was more and more momentum to try to do things through the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So that's a very long answer, but
Well, so my question deals with the actual shift between normative frameworks that you sort of maybe gave a call to at the end. To what degree should the humanitarian perspective speak the language, so to say, of the more traditional national security perspective? to convince, even if we can't say that all states can be convinced by this, to convince Western states to not, widely employ autonomous weapon systems. Should the humanitarian argue from, say arguments about ineffectiveness or unreliability, or does this engagement with the traditional normative framework simply work to reinforce it? What would you recommend?
I'm very glad about this question. So I'll talk about it briefly from different weapons categories because there are slight differences. I think, as I tried to explain on cluster munitions and landmines and so on, there is of course an obvious military utility in any particular armed conflict. But when you look at the long-term consequence, the security calculation doesn't hold up. So why should the security calculation in a particular armed conflict situation count so much more compared to devastating humanitarian impact over decades? So it's a security argument. It makes this point that will not convince a military person at the moment. Mm-hmm. But if you have a broad perspective to security that includes human security and not just, in inverted comma, the military security perspective at a particular moment, the security calculation is different. With nuclear weapons, I would make a similar point. The nuclear freeze movement in the 1980s was discredited by the believers in nuclear deterrence and so on because it was linked to the peace movement. Yeah, so so in inverted commas, these are nice people. They are well-meaning, but they don't understand security, and let them demonstrate in Central Park, but we can't really take them seriously. I think the TPNW, the argument behind the TPNW is it's a classic security argument. First of all, whose security we're talking about? Yeah, it's the security perspective of the non-nuclear majority who is affected by the practices of nuclear deterrence by the countries that have this weapon. And there is scientific evidence to back this up because we now know that the consequences are much more global and much more transboundary, and the risks are much higher than previously understood. So from the perspective of the countries that do not have these weapons, this is a security argument. But in addition to that, you can make the argument that even for the countries who have these weapons, I understand strategic stability, all these points, that's absolutely clear. It's quite cogent. It's a theory that has been developed over decades, but it is, at the end of the day, it's based on an awful lot of assumptions and insecurities. It is a theory at the end of the day. It projects outcomes, it projects psychology and so on. And if you weigh the insecurities and risks inherent in nuclear deterrence with the known body of scientific evidence, what happens if only once something goes wrong, the security calculus around this should shift as well. So it's not the argument of the 1980s, the well-meaning peaceniks and tree huggers. It's the argument, it's a cogent security argument that needs to be, and we need to have this discourse. And actually, if you look at new and disruptive technologies, they now add an awful lot of new risk drivers, from hypersonic weapons that further reduce the decision time to potential integration of artificial intelligence, to cyber vulnerabilities into nuclear command and control systems. So at what stage the discussion needs to be, we understand the nuclear deterrence thinking and how difficult it is to extract yourself from this paradigm, but what needs to happen for this security calculus to shift and be replaced by another security calculus that actually has probably a lot more scientific base to back it up, because we know more about the impact and risks of nuclear weapons if something ever goes wrong, then we know about that nuclear deterrence will work in all circumstances. So this is the conversation that we need to have. And on autonomous weapon systems, it's absolutely clear that these weapons will be coming. So the humanitarian disarmament approach does not or can no longer argue for these weapons to never happen, because that ship has sailed. They will be there. But the question is to have some level of regulation to prevent the sort of worst nightmare scenarios. And I would argue that or at least I have not been convinced that it is in the security interest of any state to have weapons that you don't really understand how they function, that you can't really predict what they will do, that you may not be able to control, and that you may not be able to stop. So these are the things that need to be dealt with through legally binding approaches. It doesn't mean that these weapons will not be in the battlefield. Of course they will be, because everybody wants to have these weapons. But to have some basic sense of regulating some aspects, including some level of human decision-making. So the humanitarian disarmament approach to autonomous weapons is probably more limited, but nevertheless extremely crucial.
Do you find that language to be effective, or do you think it could be effective in actually convincing regulators and lawmakers that these, like, having these weapons that are, feasibly a black box from a national security perspective is contrary to security interests?
I think,
it makes sense, obviously, but do you think that actually gets people?
I think the US is very concerned about black box, for example, and understands the risks of bias, and the problem in inverted commas with the US is that they don't really support legally binding approaches, but that's a political issue because it's very difficult to get any treaty in Congress. But I think the US is very much understands the complexities that somehow need to be dealt with, maybe not through legally binding approaches. Again, what the next administration will do, we don't know, but at least in the last few years, what I've observed is that the US is very active. They promoted a political declaration on the responsible use of artificial intelligence. So there is a big discussion going on. I think the divergence is on the legal aspects and some of the definitional issues, but the security concern, I think, is very, very clear to the US. Of course, the US military is also investing huge amounts of money into developing this system.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for your input. I'm particularly interested also in this negotiation process regarding autonomous weapons. In many aspects, it also reminded me of the research I did on arms treaties and arms transfers to non-state actors, actually, especially this contradictory position of the US that you just described. So I wanted to ask actually on the position of the US, but also I'm interested a lot in the position of China, also against the background that the US has adopted last year, I think, these export laws on semiconductor products to prevent China to produce autonomous weapon systems.
What's the exact question?
Yeah, so now you already answered the question on the position of the US, so I was interested in the position of China.
China is taking part in the group of governmental experts, not extremely actively. They follow it very closely. They are engaged. The position in detail, they have agreed to the few things that we were able to agree in the group of governmental experts. China has abstained on the resolution that we put forward in the General Assembly. So I think they're holding their cards quite close to the chest. On the semiconductor issue, I don't know. So I think China may go along if we actually achieve something in the context of the Certain Conventional Weapons Convention, but at the moment they can sit tight and watch nothing much happening there. So yeah, I can't really say anything else.
Okay, and the US is openly opposing this regulate? Yeah.
Well, the way we deal with it we only have a discussion mandate. So we discuss elements of a future instrument without prejudging its nature. So the US can go along with that because it could be legally binding or not. But of course, that's still the kind of, it's the discussion part. We would probably, ideally, we would get to a negotiation mandate which would still say the same thing, without prejudice to the nature of the instrument. So I hope we may get the US to agree to something like that. If we then achieve something, it's pretty obvious that the US would probably not be able to ratify it. I mean, in the Arms Trade Treaty, I think that's probably as far as what we can expect that the US engages in the negotiation, makes sure that the outcome is according to its general principles, that gives cover to its allies to be more engaged in the negotiations, but then actually not ratifying it, which of course is not the ideal way of strengthening international law. But that's the reality. But on autonomous weapons, we're still several steps removed from that. Yeah, we are in a loop of discussing, and it's not foreseeable that we would get out of that. That's the problem.
We have Zid and Okhil. I do want to encourage the students, if you have questions, do raise your hand and as well.
In light of your experience, I would really want to hear more, and I understand if you say you wish not to say more because you alluded to it a bit in your presentation, which was fascinating, by the way. How do you see the coming years in light of the election of the Trump administration, in light of the rise of autocratic regimes and so on? And again, I understand that your delicate position, so any insights that you can give would be wonderful.
Of course, it's
well, it relates a little bit to the future. My question, in the sense, so maybe I can immediately ask it, because what's the next steps in your proposal or next stages? Because my question is about the resolution you mentioned 2 weeks ago, which uses language that I find hard as a non-dip to understand what the idea is. And I know the Secretary General's report of last June used the phrase open informal consultations. But if I read the key paragraph, which decides to hold open informal consultations for 2 days, I'm wondering, what is it? And what is then the actual approach, and what is the actual intent, and what's the kind of the idea for the way forward? Is the idea during those 2 days to already have some kind of document that can be discussed? Is it really only, okay, now we're just going to talk and then we have to decide again further in the future to do something else? But yeah.
You put the finger into a very big open wound. I'm happy to talk about that. On Trump administration, of course, it's purely speculative. We don't know. I think a lot of experts refer to the unpredictability. So we don't know. It could go, of course, many different ways. There could be all sorts of breakthroughs that we don't see at the moment. But based on the experience of the first Trump administration, there is a very strong skepticism, or at least was at that time, towards international institutions, multilateralism, international law-based approaches. So it's a very, America first already says it all. So we don't know. There was, of course, you probably know that in the election campaign, there was a lot of discussion about what is the status of this Project 2025. That is the think tank, the Heritage Foundation, which they themselves promoted it as being the sort of policy foundation of a future Trump administration. Then Trump said that's not true, but we don't know. But when I look at it in the nuclear weapons dimension, there are lots of things that I find very concerning, including preparing to resume nuclear testing, among others. So if that is the blueprint, then we will have serious problems. But of course, it's speculative, so I don't know. I think I would make the point it's then particularly important for countries that believe, or actors beyond states, but really stakeholders who believe in multilateralism and think this actually is the way to go with all the weaknesses that these institutions have, because the challenges that we face can only be dealt with in a collaborative way, that we actually get our act together better and coordinate better and put aside some differences better and actually keep this flame burning. And on the resolution, and first of all, I'm really glad that this is being read. So so what you see was adopted is not it wasn't the starting point. Yeah? So we had to reduce the level of ambition significantly to keep the support for the resolution high. So we looked at the report from the Secretary General as actually being very comprehensive and supporting the case for very serious engagement by the General Assembly. And we actually proposed much more intensive informal consultations to take place over several days, both in Geneva and in New York. We planned for a chair, we planned for a mandate, what consultations were supposed to do, look at the areas beyond IHL, try to define areas of convergence and so on. And all this had to be kicked out because mostly countries from my own group, my friends from the EU and others, really wanted to be absolutely, they were adamant about nothing can be done except the work in a group of governmental experts, which is actually chaired by, of course, an ambassador from the Netherlands. And he's doing a very good job, but of course he's operating in an environment that's very difficult. So we had to reduce the resolution then, these consultations, even though they were a very clear recommendation from the Secretary General, we had to reduce them to 2 days instead of 10. We had to kick out the mandate. There's no chair. So actually we talk about autonomous weapons, and we talk about the points that were raised in the report, but it doesn't point into any direction. So that has been watered down terribly. I think it's really weak now, and it's actually really disappointing that these points were made specifically from Western countries, which indicate to me, as I said, the absolute preference or that precedent is given to be in this group of governmental experts where you have the other major players. And if the geopolitical dynamic is such that we can't move forward, okay, so be it, but no readiness to look at norm setting through other discussions. So I found I found it depressing because it just means that we will continue to discuss while the technological speed where these weapons is pushed forward, and we don't actually work on regulatory answers to it. And time is going by, and it's a real race against time with this, because very soon we will say the window for prevention is closed, and then we have, how do we deal with this when these weapons are really widespread in the hands of non-state actors and so on? The challenges will be much, much bigger than they are now.
Also for this informative and experiences. So I have observation and then a question on that. In international law, there are de jure position and de facto position. So de jure position means that the legally recognized position or the legally accepted positions or instruments. So even if there is a treaty or convention on the humanitarian disarmament,
After that, then there is a problem we are facing nowadays, that is selective application of selective compliance of that kind of instrument. And that selective compliance pushing the arm industry in different positions. They became the norm setter. For example, nowadays that in Ukraine the war is going on, so it has become a testing ground for the arms industry. And that testing ground is helping indirectly or maybe with the narrative or with the support of certain powerful countries. Now it is not letting go the way the objectives you were meant to, that we should go with the humanitarian approach, but de facto position is totally opposite to it. Even if we have a treaty on that, still, who are going to comply with that? The people, the country which doesn't have access to the army, or the countries who are setting the norms that where to apply the army, where not to apply. So how do you look at it? That double standard is going to remain in the international affairs.
I agree. Double standards are there. I think none of the humanitarian disarmament instruments are universal, obviously. Most of them do not include at least some, if not most, of the major military powers, which are also adamant in pointing out that they do not accept any customary international law effect of these instruments. Maybe it's a little bit easier to argue that with the anti-personnel landmines than with any of the other humanitarian instruments, because of course, again, compliance is not universal, quite the opposite, but there really has been a change of state practice beyond the membership of the Mine Treaty. Certainly not the case with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and also not the case with the treaty with the Conventional Cluster Munitions. So absolutely clear. The value of these treaties is always, I mean, not the value, the logic of these treaties is always both legal and political. And on the legal dimension, you're absolutely right. Yeah, it's the picture on compliance is very checkered, absolutely. Which is a function of the fact of the non-universal membership, the fact that the major military powers often stay outside. So the humanitarian disarmament crowd, for lack of better word expression, is trying to strengthen the norm by increasing the numbers. So increasing the normative value of these treaties to project more political clout. So the real value, I think, or the value, or maybe the word is transformational potential, lies in the political effect that these weapons have. And of course, that's not absolute, and it's a work in progress, and it's sort of moving targets. But I think let's look at the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which currently has still under 100 countries that have signed. So we don't even have the half of the number of UN member states. But what would it mean politically if, for example, for the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, who also happen to be the 5 nuclear weapon states in the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, what would it happen for the legitimacy of the nuclear weapon states to grow, and for the legitimacy of the P5 as in their role as guardians for international peace and security under the UN Charter, if the vast majority of countries have voted with their feet by joining the TPNW, underscoring that from their perspective, the legitimacy of the status quo is no longer there. Will it lead immediately to a change of practice? Probably not. Does it have political weight in potentially pushing countries to do more in implementing the NPT, to take more steps. At least the transformational potential is there, and I think that's the value of it. It doesn't lead automatically to change of state behavior. So it's always a mixture between the legal dimension and the political. Have I answered your question? I'm not sure, but please, if I veered off in another direction.
From academic perspective, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Final question.
Yes.
For me, it's quite a depressing topic. What gives you hope?
Well, I think because, of course, the discussion is very much dominated by the countries that have these weapons, by the countries who set the discourse. But there is really an entire different discourse out there. If you talk to the so-called global South, if you talk to Latin America, if you talk to ASEAN countries, they really have a different perspective on those issues. So on all these weapons issues, there is a sort of second tier of think tanks, academia, partly feeding the prevailing narrative, and it's very dominant, and that's where the money is, and that's also where the careers are in think tanks and so on. And there is much less on the other side of the arguments, but this discourse is really there, and it's really. I think what I find encouraging is this working in cross-regional setups where you actually see that there is a clear majority of countries who really looks at these issues differently from the prevailing discourse that is in the media and so on. So I think it's partly about getting our act together better, being more organized. So it's always it's sort of putting up a counter arguments. It's a discourse process. Obviously, we will never be able to coerce anyone to give up any weapon, let alone nuclear weapons. But it's part of the discursive process that is so important, and trying to put something against that. And I think there's a lot out there. So really, if you talk to specifically the Latinos and some of the African countries that are active on those issues, it's really interesting. There's an entirely different perspective out there, and in many ways they're right, I think. So we in the North, or in the West, we are on a very dangerous path at the moment, and so maybe they can help us to shift a little bit.
Thank you.
But I think the topic is an endless one. There's a lot of talk about humanitarian aspects, and especially autonomous weapons and development. Personally, I think that the terminology is crucial in this process, and then using terminology as killer robots is leading to a specific mindset on the development of
Terminator,
autonomous weapons, and etc. in the battlefield. And I think it's a very, very dangerous terminology to be used, because we know that the fear of new weapons is something that has been going on for centuries, basically. And we've seen that in the development of the automatic firing machine, and we've seen that throughout the process until today. We see it for going on in the future. And to the extent that technology cannot be stopped, I think that some of the effort should be aimed on the how and not necessarily on the what. Meaning that you talk about the technological bias that could be within the programs of that. and human bias is there just as well.
Mm.
You know, you talked about ethics and accountability and the judgment of a human being. At the same time, you can talk about fatigue in the battlefield, and people who are in the battlefield for days and weeks and months, and to the extent that their judgment is super problematic. Therefore, well, an algorithm doesn't get it. And, you know, there is a paper Magda and I just wrote about facial recognition techniques and targeted killings. And we looked at the technology at the moment, and we saw that currently humans are better than the technology. But at some point, the technology will be better than the human, which means that the outcome might be positive, and then working on the development of technology in a better way versus restricting it, I think the balance might be problematic, or it might lead to putting our focus on I would say a dead end, because we will not stop technology. Autonomous weapons will be there. Non-state actors eventually will have control over them, maybe even before some of the states. And if we go and actually go along with the technology, we might end up in a better result rather than if we fight technology in that sense. I don't have a question mark at the end of that.
What do you think? What do you
What
think?
do you think about?
I agree. I think I said that this is not a technology hostile approach, because this is coming, and we all know with artificial intelligence in general that there will be massive positive aspects, but there's of course a real need to discuss the potential negative aspects as well. And nowhere are they more significant than when it comes to decisions over life and death. So at least for the foreseeable future, and maybe that might shift, but I don't see that. I think it's really more an ethical issue, whether the decision over life and death should be relegated to machines.
If I may correct,
Yeah?
you don't delegate to the machine, you delegate to the person who wrote the code. The person who wrote the code is actually making the decision whether or not the life or death decision. I'm not saying you can find that accountability of that person necessarily. That would be problematic, and under the accountability issue, we have a problem.
Where the machine will base its actions on the code that has been written, but there is of course the machine learning that's context specific as well. So machines, drones, whatever, at least in the foreseeable future, will then learn according to the context based on the algorithm with which they operate. But still, so well, is then the person who wrote the code 3 years ago or 3 months ago in Palo Alto, is that person then responsible for a dramatic mistake in a wedding party in Afghanistan instead of So I think, at least for the foreseeable future, I think there is a very, very strong ethical case to be made to not relegate these decisions. That may change in the future. But I think that's why the focus of the discussions, which I think is really important, is not trying to necessarily define what an autonomous weapon is, because that's extremely difficult and will probably be outdated in 3 months. But to go from a more functional approach is really what level of human involvement we would like to have in no matter what weapon system. And I think that is something that, at least, again, it may change, and maybe in 5 years we look at this issue in a different light. But at the moment, I think this is the right approach, because it's open to whatever technological development may happen, but it retains this focus on the human accountability and on the ethical dimensions around human decision making. And it's entirely possible that we look at it differently in a few years, given the speed that we see. But at the moment, I really worry about taking these decisions away from humans at the time when the technology is not where we certainly haven't solved issues like bias and so
on. Thank you very much. We have to leave the room until 6 o'clock. So thank you very much.